Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this build video we'll be starting assembly of two Airfix 1/72nd scale Bristol Beaufighters, which I'll be doing as RAAF Mk.ICs for my upcoming film about the Battle of Milne Bay. So without further ado, let's get into making these ones. To start with, I gave both kits parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or dirt from the sprues that may prevent paint from sticking to their surfaces. I then began cutting out the various interior parts for both aircraft, including the fuselage floors, wing spars, the observer seat and raised platform, the pilot sidewalls, the control column, seat and rudders, and finally the tail wheel and fuselage halves. Once removed, the excess sprue was then sanded or gently sliced off these parts to ensure everything would fit together. Both Beaufighters were built side by side, but I'll try and avoid showing me doing the exact same thing twice. The two wing spars were glued to the cockpit floor with some Revell Contactor Professional, and then the pilot seats were glued to a mounting point forward on the spar. The control column, rudder and platform for the observer were then glued into their keyed positions on the cockpit floor. The observer's chair could apparently swivel, but I followed the instructions and glued it facing towards the rear. The sidewalls and tail wheels were glued to the inside of their fuselage halves, and all of these parts fitted precisely into keyed positions. When I started this build, I did not have my airbrush, and I was not in the habit of priming my interiors, so initially I painted 3 coats of watered down Vallejo 71035 interior grey green, which is a very nice match for a common green used in the cockpit of British aircraft. The paint was applied using a reasonably large brush, with each layer building it up until it was nice and solid. I must say I definitely prefer airbrushing now, especially for things like this, as it saves a lot of time waiting between each coat for things to dry. For some of the tricky to reach areas, I used a fine brush to apply the paint, and once the final layer had dried, I then picked out the control column and various raised details on the cockpit sidewalls with some Vallejo model colour flat black. I also painted the main instrument panel with this colour while it was still on the sprue. For the seat cushions, I went with Vallejo model colour flat earth for a nice brown with a slight reddish tone to replicate some worn leather. Although the raised details on the sidewalls are pretty decent, they are a little bit simplified and missing a few details, so I used some spare bits of sprue to add a few of the parts, such as a missing trim wheel on the right side, which was also painted flat earth. The various raised details and engine controls were then picked out using a fine brush, and initially some Vallejo model colour vermilion red. Another detail I noticed that was absent from the interior were some of the prominent railings aft of the pilot's seat. I used some fine florist wire and a bit of Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to attach them into place. My rails possibly go a bit too far aft, but only the front part of them would end up being visible, so I think it was alright. Some styrene was also glued to the sidewalls for some basic detail, and once dried I painted the rails with vermilion red. Further engine displays and other raised details were picked out with Vallejo model colour 70970 deep green, as well as some Vallejo model colour flat white. I did a couple of coats with these various colours for the details where required, and also did some touch-ups with the interior green. The last details I painted were the raised buttons on the control column with some X31 Titan gold, and then I did some light dry brushing with some Tamiya flat aluminium to create some metal chipping. This was applied mainly on the raised ribbing inside of the fuselage, and also around areas where the pilot might walk or bump into things. The instrument panel is flat with no raised details, though decals are provided for some basic instrument details. These were stuck in some warm water and then slid onto the instrument panel. To highlight the details and add some grime and weathering, I added some Tamiya black panel accent over all of the details in the interior, and once applied I then rubbed the excess away using a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners, leaving the panel liner around the edges of the raised details and in the recesses. The instrument decals were protected with a layer of matte varnish, and then after a few hours to let it dry, they were cut out of the sprue and glued to the sidewalls of each Beaufighter. Before then sealing the cockpits into the fuselages, I decided to add some fine metal wire to represent some of the aircraft's internal wiring around the wing spar centre, and with that in place, I joined the two fuselage halves. The instrument panel seemed to make the fit a little bit awkward, but otherwise they fitted together reasonably well. While the fuselage halves dried, I dry brushed the wiring I had with some white, and also dabbed some gloss varnish onto the dials of the decal on the instrument panel to replicate some of the glass on the dials. But this is a lot easier to do when the instrument panel has recesses. After a bit of black wash on the wiring, I then pushed the cockpit floor up into the fuselage and glued it into place. It took a bit of fiddling and pressure to get both cockpits into each Beaufighter, but eventually they were in. Next I cut out the lower fuselage piece, and after doing some cleanup to it, I glued it to the bottom of the fuselage. While these parts bonded, I wrapped a bit of masking tape around them to keep the fit nice and tight. I then moved on to the wings, first cutting out each side's upper and lower wing half, and then sanding away any excess sprue. Since I would be building an early version of the Beaufighter, I followed the instructions and sanded off the bulge on the top wings, and then I rescored in any panel lines that had been damaged. I probably should have noticed it sooner, but it wasn't until the very end of this build that I noticed that the machine guns are not actually drilled out in the wings. So unfortunately, as soon as the parts had been glued together, I then glued them to the wing spars and would have to correct this later on. Speaking of corrections, the early Beaufighters did not have a dihedral for their horizontal stabilisers, and they were also slightly shorter. I had a high planes conversion tail from the Beaufighter that I brought from a friend, so I ended up using this as a template to cut one of the Beaufighter's stabilisers to the correct shape. After a bit of cutting, sanding and scoring, I eventually had the correct shape from one of the kit's stabilisers, and I also adjusted the joint at the fuselage so they would fit. Initially, I tried gluing the stabilisers first, but in the end, I found it was easier to add the tail and rudder and let them dry first. While the tail and rudder dried, I cut out, cleaned up and added the nose to the front of the aircraft, making sure to leave the kit's square gun camera in place based on reference photos. My modified horizontal stabilisers were then fitted to one of the Beaufighters, though there was a very large gap that made it a bit tricky and would also have to get filled in later on. The high planes conversion set was used on the second aircraft, and though not as cleanly moulded and the details were a bit vague, they went into place a lot easier. At this point, I painted the wheel wells with Vallejo Model Air IDF green, as well as the inside of the engines, landing gear struts and doors while they were on the sprues. Much like with the cockpit, I used water to thin these acrylic paints down and applied several coats with a brush before they became solid. For some of the unpainted landing gear parts, I used some XF16 flat aluminium thinned down with some Tamiya X20A thinners instead of water. For the front of the cowling, I initially painted a few coats of X33 bronze, but later would completely repaint them. Gradually, I've been replacing my Tamiya paints with Vallejo equivalents, as I find I prefer the ease and low toxicity of their water-based paints compared to the Tamiya ones, although they are definitely not as durable. The engine cylinders were painted with Vallejo model colour 70865 oily steel for a dark metallic colour, while the frames for the engine were painted IDF green but would later get repainted to black. After a few coats, I then cut out each engine's 3 cowling parts and 2 engine halves. A bit of cleanup was required to remove the excess sprue from the cowlings, and once that was done, I glued the engine halves together, though I found the keying is very small on them, so they were a bit tricky to line up correctly. The cowlings were glued together, which was even more tricky, and they were a very fragile assembly with a few gaps. The engine was then glued to the nacelle, and the cowling slid over the top of that. The fit for the cowlings is really tight, so I found I had to sand the edges of the cylinder framework slightly to get them to fit. I was initially tempted to design and print my own set. I also believe that the early Beaufighters actually had a different cowling design, but looking at photos I couldn't really notice much of a difference, so I ended up sticking with the kit engines to save a bit of time. The exhausts on the other hand were noticeably different on the early Milne Bay Beaufighters, and I would later have to 3D print some parts for them. But for now I added the kit's exhausts once I'd cut off the flame dampener section, which would not be needed. I then added the kit's shorter options for the intakes on top of each engine, and then I began to cut out the landing gear parts. The landing gear consists mainly of 2 large frames which are added first, followed by the main struts with the wheel attachment, and then a couple of extra bits of framework. It's a bit of a fiddly assembly, but the parts fitted together very well, and are surprisingly solid once the glue had bonded. The landing gear doors were a bit fiddly to add as well, though not nearly as solid, unfortunately, due to their smaller attachment points. I then added the ailerons to the wings, which come as separate parts so they can be posed, but they will not move without serious modifications, so I decided to just glue them in place at a neutral angle. The outboard intakes were cut out and glued to the wings, and though the grille made it rather shallow, they do seem accurate shapes for the Milne Bay Beaufighters. With assembly pretty much completed, I began to fill any gaps over with some Vallejo water-based putty. A fair bit was required on the engine cowlings and also the tail due to the modifications to the horizontal stabilisers. Once applied, I gently rubbed away any excess putty using a damp finger, which left it only in the gaps. I gave the putty a full 24 hours to set, before I then used a knife and pointed scriber to restore any panel lines that were weak or had been filled over with any putty. I also did some light sanding to smooth over some of the areas. The Beaufighters were now ready to be primed for painting, so once I'd masked off the engines and cockpits with some white tack, and the undercarriage with masking tape, I then sprayed both aircraft with some Vallejo gloss black primer. This was thinned down to a ratio of 50% Vallejo acrylic flow improver to 50% primer. I built the primer up gradually on the upper surface of one Beaufighter in several passes, until eventually the model was a uniform glossy black. I then sprayed the second aircraft on the upper surface, and by the time I'd done that, the other aircraft was dry to the touch, so I sprayed it on the underside in the same fashion. Both of these kits were done in the time before I had a tank attached to my compressor, so I did have a lot of issues with water getting into my airline, even with water traps on both ends. But fortunately, during priming, I only had one instance of the water suddenly spraying all over the model, which was quickly cleaned up. And once both aircraft were primed, I set them aside for 24 hours to allow the primer to cure before moving on to painting, which is what we'll be covering next time in part 2. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and feel free to leave any friendly advice for myself and other model makers to help us improve, or any experiences you've had with this kit or thoughts in the comments below. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the time I spend making these videos and the products I use for them. Part 2 will be coming out sometime in the next week or so, as well as another build video on one of my 3D printed designs, so be sure to keep an eye out for those when they come out. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.